Okay, so back in like 2014, something happened here in Atlanta that really not a lot of people like to bring up. And if you're not from Atlanta, you're not from Georgia, you might not know about this. And it's something that really changed the way that a lot of people view Atlanta and what it's like to live here, especially in the wintertime. I think a lot of people kind of recall this story differently, but here's at least how I remember this happening back in 2014. So it was like a winter day, it was January, and I believe it was somewhere around 35 degrees outside. And it was a regular weekday afternoon, and it was kind of like cloudy. It looked like it was going to rain. Again, it was like 35 degrees, so nobody was like thinking snow. It wasn't that kind of forecast. The thing about this day is that it got like progressively colder and colder throughout the day. Instead of getting warmer in the afternoon, like you typically see, this day in January, it got colder every hour. And even though we were getting to the afternoon, it just kept creeping down to the freezing temperature, and it kept looking more and more like it was going to rain. And eventually, by about 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody kind of realized like it's going to start raining and it's going to hit the freezing point. And what you have to realize about Atlanta is that because we don't get snow very often, we don't have like salt trucks. We don't have the ability to like treat the roads so that people can drive on the roads. Like if it snows even a quarter of an inch here in Atlanta, all of the roads shut down. The grocery stores start to sell out of bread and milk and like all of the essentials. Like even the threat of snow is cause for great concern here in Atlanta. And because of what happened in 2014, it's now even more of a concern. It's like all Atlantans who lived through this thing back in 2014 are traumatized and now just freak out anytime anybody mentions snow. So as the day progressed and people started to realize that it was going to rain and it was going to reach the freezing point, a lot of the employers who are mostly in Atlanta told their employees, hey, just, call it a day. Let's everybody just go home. And instead of, getting in the middle of that rush hour traffic at around 4 or 5 o'clock, everybody left at around 2 o'clock. And it was just like the whole city realized we just need to get home. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it starts to rain, and the temperature slowly is creeping down 33 degrees, 32 degrees, 31 degrees. And what happened next is something that is etched in everybody's memory who lives here in Atlanta. All of that rain that was on the ground in that afternoon when it reached the freezing point became ice. And because we didn't treat the roads, because there was no salt on the ground, and because everybody was now traveling back to the suburbs, it became a standstill parking lot on every single street in Metro Atlanta because nobody could drive on the ice. And I don't mean that it was like a traffic jam for a few hours. This was a traffic jam for like 2 or 3 days. For days, there were cars on the road. It really wasn't even just that people were stuck on the road. For weeks, people abandoned their car and just put their car on the side of the road and walked home. There were cars littering the streets for weeks because people couldn't get their cars off of the road because of the ice. My father-in-law was in this traffic jam for like 48 hours. He didn't abandon his car, so he was just stuck behind the same car for like 2 days trying to get home. And the other thing was that people ran out of gas. So that's another reason why there were so many cars on the side of the road. I mean, people couldn't get to the gas stations, and so it just was a absolute mess. And for me, and at the time in 2014, I was working in EMS. I was an EMT on the ambulance. We would respond to 911 calls. So I was literally in the ambulance that day when the roads became a sheet of ice. And I'm not joking when I tell you, me and my partner were trying to literally push the ambulance down the road to get to 911 calls. Like people would call 911 for a car accident. We would get there an hour later and they would just be gone because they gave up on waiting there for the ambulance. I mean, it was a nightmare. So as you can imagine, this is not something that people in Atlanta want to be remembered for. This giant cluster that we experienced back in 2014. Now we do have a bit more salt trucks and, different things to treat the roads in case of this ice or in case of the snow, but it's still not nearly as efficient as it should be, or it's not as good as it is in other parts of the country where they regularly have snow. So if you're thinking about moving here and you're thinking, oh, we're going to get away from the snow, we don't have to deal with the crazy drivers in the snow. Like the drivers here in Atlanta, when it snows, are probably worse than any other part of the country. We are just traumatized when it comes to the snow on the road. So this is really something that you got to think about. Like if you're new to Atlanta, you probably don't want to be on the road when it snows. So definitely a scar on the history of Atlanta. And there are plenty of other things that we just don't talk about here in Atlanta, especially when it comes to new people moving here and giving them advice. So let's talk about a few other things that you need to know about if you're new to Atlanta. As always, if you're thinking about moving here and you want to know what it's like to live in Atlanta, feel free to call, text, or email me anytime. I'm the one who answers the phone. I'm the one who answers those messages. Thank you so much to everybody who has reached out. I'm always happy to help. So another thing that you should know about is that the schools in Georgia in general are not nearly as good as the public school systems in other parts of the country. In general, the South is kind of known for having a poor public school system. Now, many of the suburbs that we talk about here on this channel, like Marietta and Alpharetta, we mainly cover the suburbs that are super popular and have excellent schools. So Duluth, Swanee, Woodstock, Roswell, these all have very good public schools. But outside of this northern part of Metro Atlanta, the public schools are something that you should worry about. Like the southern part of Metro Atlanta is not really known for having excellent public schools. So certainly something to consider. And then another thing that you should know is that we do in fact have a higher crime rate here in Atlanta than maybe other parts of the US. I don't really watch the news. I don't know, but I think Atlanta makes the news sometimes for having different crime things happening here in the city. And it really is a problem, especially as Atlanta is just exploding in growth and as there are problems within the police departments here in Atlanta and other parts of the country and shortages of police officers. The crime is certainly something that you need to be aware of if you're going to be in Atlanta. One big factor that you need to know about if you're thinking about buying a home in Atlanta is that very often the homes here have deferred maintenance. This is super common here, and I think it kind of has to do with the fact that the home values are a bit lower here than in other parts of the country, and because of that, people are less willing to put time and money into their homes. So in other parts of the country, when you put $5 or $10 or $20,000 into renovating some part of your home, you can kind of expect that investment to be recuperated in the value of the home when you sell it. Not so much here in Metro Atlanta when you have homes that are 5-bed, 4-bath homes as low as $400,000 in some parts of Metro Atlanta. It's really hard to put $20,000 into that home and get much of a return on that investment. Home values are already low here. They don't really go very high. You can't put $20,000 into new flooring or a new kitchen and expect to get that back, especially if you paid for a home at the top of what the other homes in the neighborhood are selling for. So if all of the homes in the neighborhood are selling somewhere around 400,000 and you pay 400,000, you can't put $20,000 into the home and expect the home to be now worth 420 or even more. Like the home will only be worth as much as the average sold price in the area. So really something that you got to think about if you want to buy a home here, especially investment properties here in Metro Atlanta. And then while it is great that we have lower home values, something else that people don't really talk about much is that with the lower cost of living here in Metro Atlanta is also the lower paying jobs. I have a client who recently came here from California who was an electrician and was making somewhere around $50 or $60 an hour. I believe he told me here in Metro Atlanta, he makes closer to $20 an hour. And this is a big difference, not just for electricians, but for many other blue collar jobs and many other office jobs. I mean, in general, employers just tend to pay less because the cost of living is less here. One thing that nobody really talks about when it comes to living in Atlanta is Stone Mountain. Yeah, you may have heard that Stone Mountain was a cool place to visit, but did you also know that there is a giant, enormous Confederate monument from back during the Civil War on Stone Mountain? To this day, it remains a sore subject and a point of controversy among many of the people who live in Metro Atlanta. Like anytime you go to Stone Mountain, you're going to see this giant Confederate monument. And many people want to know, like, why are we still allowing this monument to stay on the mountain? Why are we not taking it down or doing something to cover it up? And so it's certainly a hot topic here in Metro Atlanta and something that you should know. Not only is there a Confederate monument there, but nobody is really doing anything about it. So that may be a cause for alarm if you're thinking about moving here. Another big thing that really a lot of people kind of don't think about when it comes to moving to Atlanta is that not only do we have a lot of humidity here, which is kind of surprising to some people, but we have a lot of humidity, especially during the summertime. We also have a lot of vegetation here, lots of trees, lots of pine trees. But what comes with lots of humidity and lots of vegetation is lots of seasonal allergies. This is certainly a problem for many people, including myself here in Metro Atlanta. I take like a seasonal allergy pill like once a day during that time of year because of how bad it is. And it all has to do with how much vegetation and how many trees we have here. Things like pollen are just terrible during allergy season here in Metro Atlanta. And then another one that goes right along with that, the amount of vegetation and the humidity, is the amount of bugs that we have here. We have a ton of insects and bugs that get into your house. Like, it's certainly a problem. You have to have pest control. If you live in Georgia, you have to have quarterly or monthly pest control for your home. It's an absolute must. Otherwise, you will have spiders and roaches in your home. Yeah, nobody really talks about that, but it's certainly something that happens here, and pest control is a must when you live in Georgia. A lot of things to think about if you're thinking about moving here. If you want to know more about the bright side of living in Atlanta and what it's like to live here and what it feels like to be a resident of Atlanta, check out this video. I'll see you there.